I am Leanna Schooley. I'm the Assistant Director for the Center for Texas Studies at TCU. We do a number of programs across Fort Worth, but our workshops are very important to us in helping people learn not only about their own history, but to learn how to preserve your own history, conduct your own research, preserve the important parts of our past. We're able to bring you this workshop series through a generous grant from the Summerlee Foundation. We do these programs once a month, the first Saturday of the month, from January to May, and then September until December. If you're interested in checking out what our upcoming programs will be, you can always go to our website, which is texasstudies.org. We send out a monthly email about our programs. And if you would like to be sure and get on that list, if you're not on it already, please be sure and put your email address on the sign-in sheet, and I will add you to the list to get those notices. We don't spam you, it's just one. And I promise I won't give it to anybody else. For next month, I want to welcome you to come on December 7th here to the library, where you will hear Renee Gomez, who was up here introducing Betty just a moment ago. He's going to give a program about misfortunes in the river bottoms, a little slice of the dark side of Fort Worth history, some intriguing and mysterious stories. So come and hear that in December. And so I want to introduce today's program. Susan Allen Kline is a historian and historic preservationist, lives here in Fort Worth. She has done 28 National Register nominations, as well as many other projects. That's in Fort Worth. She's done others across the state, and her work has been recognized by multiple awards. And the program she's going to be talking about today is a project that started with her National Register nominations of the Fort Worth Botanical Gardens, which expanded into an interest into the Fort Worth Parks system as a whole, resulting in the book Fort Worth Parks, put out by Acadia Press within the last couple of years, 2 years ago. Mm-hmm. So she is going to talk to you about all the wonderful and fascinating things that she learned in the course of this project, and about the importance of our public parks. So please welcome Susan.
Thank you, Leanna, and good morning. I'm happy to see everyone here, and so I can talk about one of my favorite subjects, Fort Worth parks. What I've enjoyed about learning about our parks is how much information it gives me about so many other facets of our city. You know, not just the spatial development of it, but also things, social issues, things like segregation, how the Depression was actually good for our parks, what happened after the war, you know, how did our city change after that. I started with these two photographs because I think they sort of help describe some of what I'm talking about. The upper left photo is from the Library of Congress. It was taken by Alfred T. Palmer in the early 1940s. Excuse me. He was a photographer for the Farm Security Administration and traveled across the country to take photos, and one of them was at our Fort Worth Botanic Garden. But what I really love about this photo is that it was used among a montage of photographs to illustrate FDR's ideals of the four freedoms. And it was used to illustrate the freedom from fear. And I think that's what we really like about our parks, to be able to go and just enjoy ourselves and not have to worry about anything. And I think that photo really captures that. The other photo I included tells us a little bit more about parks from after the war, from the 1970s, where we were facing such issues as urban renewal. This was a park, the Water Gardens, that was constructed in downtown Fort Worth in an area that some had considered had really met on hard times. And so this was an effort to revitalize our city. And then also I think the contrast of what the people are wearing in the photographs. You know, in the pre-war era, going to a park was a big deal. And people would dress up to it, particularly the Botanic Garden. You would go there to enjoy the botanical aspects of the garden. Whereas the lower photograph, we have probably a father and a daughter, much more casually dressed. A park from this era, the urban park, a lot of them had to deal with water. And so we see that here. A lot of the parks that were being done in the major cities had water features, and this was an example of that here in Fort Worth. As our cities began to develop in the frontier, there wasn't a lot of thought given to parks or public spaces. If we think about Fort Worth, there was, of course, first the fort, and there would have been probably a parade ground and that type of thing. But after the fort disbanded, and then we had the creation of a courthouse square, but that really wasn't meant to be a spot for recreation. And as our city developed, developers were more interested in selling lots, not making them public places, because they don't make any money off of that. And the city also didn't have any money to create parks. The one exception in this area is North Fort Worth, and it was designed with public spaces in mind. This is Circle Park. This was created by Nathan Barrett, who was a landscape architect from the East. And he was sort of able to create a whole city at once, and so he had Circle Park here. He had another open space here that became Marine Park. He had this wonderful esplanade here. And the whole axis of his design centered on the courthouse. And at the time that this design would have been done, the courthouse wasn't the courthouse we had now. It was, a two-story, much smaller building. But he had the forethought to think about, how is the city going to develop? And so we have this focal point here. And this is a view a little bit later, 50 years later, from the creation of his design. Unfortunately, as often happens with our parks, is they get used for other things. And Circle Park was one of those parks, and part of it was given over to a school. So this photograph is taken from the top of the hill where the school is, but you can see, how wonderfully it lined up with the downtown skyline. And then this is a photograph I took a few years ago from about the same spot. And again, our parks became a victim of our expansion, and we had a library, sorry for the library folks for me to say this, but a library got plopped right in the middle of the park. And so it sort of ruined this whole vista. So that's happened throughout our history, that our parks have been the victims of our expansion, and we'll see a little bit more of that as we go through. The first park that Fort Worth had, a public park, there were private parks, but the first public park was Hyde Park, which is downtown, and it was given to the city in 1873 by the Jennings family. It wasn't really developed until we started to get a park system established in the early part of the 1900s. The first park that was actually purchased for park purposes was City Park, or what we now know as Trinity Park. It was part of a 50-acre plot that the city bought. Part of it was to be used for the waterworks, and that's where the Holly water treatment plant is. It spanned both sides of the river, so we had the water plant on one side and the park on the other. But in 1872, we did not have a park department. We didn't have a lot of means to improve the park. There was one employee who did a few gardens, but most of the work that was done until the creation of a park department was done by groups such as the women's clubs, and they funded many of the developments, including a gate. These two quotes I picked out because they kind of represent the views that people had of parks during this era. One was kind of a romanticized view of what parks could do for us aesthetically, and the other was sort of an economic view of how parks could be important to the development of our cities. The first quote is by Sidney Hare, who was the father of the landscape architecture firm Hare & Hare, who became very important in the development of Fort Worth parks beginning in 1925. And he said, "Parks educate people in an art equally as grand as the art of painting or sculpture. They influence people to adorn their home grounds, to plant trees and shrubs, and to study nature, the mother of all true art." And then the other quote is from George Kessler, who would also have an influence on the development of Fort Worth parks. He was the first person who the city hired to create a park master plan. And he provides us more with an economic view of parks. In the competition of cities for new and desirable population, no other element of advertisement is worth so much as an ample and attractive park system, making a pleasant city in which to live comfortably. And this was taken directly from his park master plan for Fort Worth. And we can see as Fort Worth started to have more parks, how the developers who had residential areas bordering the parks said, hey, our development is right next to this park, so come buy your lot here and you'll be close to all these great amenities. As I said, Kessler was the person who created our first park plan. He was invited to the city in 1908 by the Park League, which was an organization that was formed to study the creation of parks. How do we get a park movement going here in Fort Worth? So they brought him here in November to first look things over, and then the city council agreed to hire him for $1,500 to create this park master plan. He was from Kansas City. He was actually born in Germany and had lived in Dallas as a young boy, but he ended up in Kansas City, and there he gained a lot of fame for the work he did for the Kansas City park system. So that's how he became known, particularly in this part of the area. He would also do park master plans in Oklahoma City and also in Dallas. He did the Dallas ones a couple of years after he did the Fort Worth one. This is his master plan, and he had several key components of it. One of it was to use the courthouse and the area around it as the focal point of the park system. And then from that, it would sort of radiate from there into the neighborhoods. He thought it was very important to preserve the bluffs because that was the genesis of the city of Fort Worth. And they had those wonderful bluffs, and he knew what an aesthetic value those were. So he advocated for the acquisition of the bluffs and the creation of what he called the Fort Plaza. He was very interested in developing drives along the river, and this would be something we're going to see throughout the development of our parks, is our interest in development or improving the river, but it always didn't happen when we wanted it to, and so it was kind of a continual struggle what to do with the river. But he had it very early in his plan. He also advised, acquiring certain areas that were wooded or for whatever reason he thought would make attractive parks. One of them was Tyler's Lake, which is in near East Fort Worth, which is now Glenwood Park. He also recommended acquiring what became Forest Park and Sycamore Park. This is an early view of Forest Park in 1909. That would have been the year that it was that the city bought it. Kessler also advocated for the actual creation of a park department. So there was a revision made to the city charter in 1909 so that we could have a park board and a park department, which gave the city the means to acquire park land. So this was one of the early ones that was acquired, and he particularly liked Forest Park because of its topography, its variations between open spaces and wooded areas, as we can see in this early photograph. Forest Park would also become the location of our zoo. There's been some folklore about how the zoo got started. Some people say it got started because the city bought animals from a traveling circus or something like that, but I've not been able to confirm that. The zoo in Forest Park mostly got its start through donation of animals, very easily acquired animals. There was also actually, at the time of the Forest Park Zoo, when it was created, there was a small little zoo in Trinity Park. So although the zoo, credits 1909 as their creation date, it really wasn't until about 1913 that they really committed to developing a zoo there. But as I said, the first animals were normally easily acquired animals until 1923 when they acquired Queen Tut, the elephant. She was 3 years old at the time that they acquired her, and of course that created a great sensation to have this elephant in the zoo. And Queen Tut would become a very beloved feature of the zoo, living until about 1964, I believe, early 60s. And a lot of people remember them parading Queen Tut through the neighborhoods, or being able to even ride on her, such as this young girl there. Kessler came up with his own plan for the bluff. This was done in 1909. As I said, there wasn't much that was done towards accomplishing this. So in 1912, some city leaders published a postcard, and this is what this is from, to try to get the word out there that, hey, this is what our courthouse square, what our gateway from the north into the city, what it should look like. And so he advocated for, these terraces here, and then all this development along the bluff. And we're going to see this continually throughout the next 60 years, what are we going to do with this bluff? And at the time he was thinking of this block, which is now Paddock Park, would have been the location of the jail and some other commercial buildings. So he was really envisioning a recreation of this whole area. Kessler mostly gave us a plan, a master plan. He didn't really provide individual plans for parks. So some of the earliest improvements were done by either local architects or employees of the park department. And one of the earliest surviving remnants that I've been able to identify are these stairs at Forest Park. They're right behind the Forest Park pool. This was done earlier before the streetcar. No, I guess the streetcar would have been there. The streetcar would have gone down Forest Park, and the top of the stairs would have connected near to where the streetcar that went to TCU came through. But these stairs were actually built by the city's gardener, and this is a view of him today. We know that the pool was recently restored and opened last summer, so this is one of my hopes, is that somebody's going to take an interest in these stairs and get them back into working order. But it's really a wonderful site. If you've not been there, I would encourage you to go seek them out. That's what I did. I had heard about these stairs. I'm not from Fort Worth, so I had heard about them, and I wasn't even sure they were still there. So when I found them, it was just really a pleasant surprise for me. And then some other early improvements that we still have are the Forest Park gates. These were designed by local architect John Pollard. This was the view on the left. It was a drawing that appeared in one of the newspapers, and as you can see, there was originally supposed to have kind of a seat wall along the sides of it, but that didn't get executed. But happy to say that the towers are still with us and were recently restored. Our parks also tell us about social customs. Although there was never actually a statute that prohibited African Americans from going into parks, it was just kind of an unwritten rule that they weren't supposed to go into certain public parks. So parks were created for them. The first one that was set aside for African Americans was Douglas Park, which actually started out as a private park started by African Americans, and then the city purchased it in 1918. They sold it, and then they purchased it again. It was located just to the east of the Paddock Viaduct, right along the river. So some of these early parks, particularly for African Americans, weren't located in the most in the best areas. This one was particularly subjected to flooding, and so there would be that issue. The same with Loveland Park. The city had even forgotten it had this park. It was given to them probably in the 1890s, and one of the park directors in around 21 kind of rediscovered it, and so they set it aside for African Americans. Social Park was in the southeast part of downtown. In 1921, it was designated as a park for African Americans. Harmon Field started out in the 1920s, just a few acres that was purchased with money provided by the Harmon Foundation, which is how it got its name. And then in the 1950s, it was greatly expanded with the creation of a golf course and then a recreation center. Dixie Park was originally a private park, and the city purchased it in 1926. It was on the Near East Side near Rosedale and Evans Avenue, a little bit further east of that. Greenway Park, we still have Como Park and Bunch Park. Greenway, we'll see in a minute, was another one of those parks that became a victim to progress. Burkburnett Park downtown was the largest downtown park for a while. Part of it was given to the city by Samuel Burkburnett, the cattleman, and then the city also purchased some of the adjoining area. But it wasn't until the 1920s that it was really improved. And I think this was one of those instances where George Kessler was creating a plan for this particular park. Unfortunately, Burkburnett died in 1922, and then Kessler died in 1923, so it would be up to somebody else to fulfill Kessler's plan for Brunette Park. And that person would be S. Herbert Hare of the firm Hare & Hare, who I mentioned earlier. After the death of Kessler, Hare & Hare became the city's park consultants. They were hired in November 1924, but we generally consider 25 as when they really got active in their study of the Fort Worth parks. And from 1925 to 1930, that's how long they took to create their park plan, master plan for the city. And in that, they created various designs for individual parks, which we'll see in a bit. But this is a photo on the left of Herbert Hare at Brunette Park, which he said was one of his favorite parks in the city. And then on the right shows the design that was implemented for Brunette Park. My husband and I have had the opportunity to actually go to the archives where Hare & Hare's materials are, and we saw this beautiful linen drawing for Brunette Park, and it had Kessler's name on it. So I think Hare & Hare were pretty faithful in carrying out Kessler's plan for Brunette Park. In the 1920s, that's when we finally begin to see the appearance of parks within neighborhoods. You know, before that, the city pretty much had to purchase parkland or have it donated to them, and it was usually on the edges of the city. But here, we're beginning to see them incorporated within the designs of neighborhood developments. And one of the reasons is because many of the developments were designed by Hare & Hare. Not only did they do the park development, but they did many residential plans, subdivision plans, plans for later shopping centers, hospital grounds, that type of thing. They did over 200 projects in Fort Worth. Not all of them were executed, but that's how prevalent they were here. And in my mind, they are the ones who really gave us the shape of our city, at least up until the 1960s. 1920s also began to see the addition of shelters, substantial shelters in our parks. They weren't necessarily designed by Hare & Hare, but Hare & Hare was usually involved in the actual placement of them. Shelters that Hare & Hare we know were involved with were the ones for Inspiration Point. Unfortunately, the top one is no longer with us. There's still the foundation for it. If you go out there, you'll see it. The lower one, thankfully, was just restored recently. Art Weinman was the architect for that. So if you go out to Inspiration Point, you'll be able to experience a shelter similar to this original one. As I said, Hare & Hare was very much involved with the placement of the shelters. The Hillside Park shelter was placed. Hillside was also one of those ones that had some rolling topography, and so this shelter was placed up on the hill, much like what we think about the Circle Park, so that it would have a great view of downtown. Unfortunately, that shelter is no longer with us. The Capps Park shelter is. Many of these shelters were considered innovative because They could be used for a variety of things, you know, not only just to maybe have your picnic there, but they could also be used for public performances. And some of these also had dressing rooms or restrooms underneath them. And so this was considered a little bit innovative, and there were photos of some of these shelters that appeared in professional park magazines. In 1922, we had the creation of a separate recreation department out of the park department. So from that, we had the construction of a recreation building. You may be familiar with this. This building is still here on Vickery Boulevard, just west of Jennings Avenue. And then by 1930, Hare presents his master plan, and in many ways it had similarities to Kessler's plan. He envisioned linking parks by parkways or along the rivers. You can see he's pretty much encircled the city with greenways, parkways, beltways, that type of thing. After the development of the park plan, you know, that was at the beginning of the Depression, and so although all these plans had been done, there was fear, you know, that they would never be implemented, or it would be years before they were implemented. But with the advent of many New Deal programs, our parks were able to take advantage of federal money to develop our parks. And one of the earliest ones was the Botanic Garden, which at the time was Rock Springs Garden. And in '29, they started working on an arboretum and the development of the Rock Springs area from which the park got its name. There were natural springs there. And so they created rivulets and little waterfalls and lagoons. This is to the south of the Rose Garden. If you've been to the Botanic Garden, this area is just right next to it. People may be familiar with the story of Queen Tut being brought over to the Botanic Garden to wallow around in the pond to make it hold water. Well, a lot of people think that it was for this pond here, but from interviews that I've found with the forester who was in charge with the development of the park, it leads me to believe that it was actually one of these lagoons and not the big pond that many of us are familiar with. But beginning in 1933, the city took advantage of some of the federal programs to begin work on the Municipal Rose Garden. You know, it was very complex. The design had the rose ramp here, an access here going to another rose garden, and the pond here. And they thought it would take years to implement it, but because they had the use of federal funds, people from the relief rolls to build it, they actually built the rose garden in 9 months. This is a photo of the oval rose garden. These are the men who were hired, some of the men who were hired to build it. There were over probably 450 men who actually built the Botanic Garden. And this is one of the great stories of the Botanic Garden. In the early part of the New Deal programs, the workers weren't actually given cash, they were given a meal ticket. And because there were so many men who were on the relief rolls, they could only work in short shifts, such as 2 or 3 days, and then they would bring another shift of men on so they could get their meal tickets. But many of these men became so enamored with what they were doing that they would come and work for free. And that's probably one reason it got done in 9 months. As I mentioned, as Hare was developing his master plan, he also came up with individual park plans. This was a plan he did for Mosque Point at Lake Worth. The plan on the left is from 1930, and then on the right is from the National Park Service. They used Hare's plan for Mosque Point, and another one we'll see in a minute, to develop it pretty much as he had in this plan. And the National Park Service became involved here through the Civilian Conservation Corps. That was another one of the New Deal programs that was created to put people to work, particularly young men between the ages of 18 and 25 initially. So it was these young men under the auspices of the National Park Service who did many of the improvements at Lake Worth. These are photos of the Mosque Point shelter. The one on the left is shortly after it was completed. The one on the right is as it looks now. There was a fire there, so you'll notice they changed the form of the roof a little bit, but other than that, it's still there. And there's also some trails that go down to the lake behind it. And then there was also an outhouse, which is actually still there across the street. But we've lost some of the things, such as the log seating. Broadview area of Lake Worth was also developed under the CCC, and I'm fairly certain that it was Herbert Hare who came up with the plan for the shelter, which is what we see on the left, and I'm happy to say that that shelter is going to be restored. But there were quite a few resources that were done in this area. The upper right one was an outhouse or comfort station. And then I really love the banquet picnic tables that are at the lower right. But the CCC did very many improvements, trails, roads, things such as clearing trees, planting trees, fighting forest fires. They were there for about 4 years at Lake Worth. Now this is an example of a shelter that's also at Lake Worth. The Broadview Shelter and these next two shelters I'm showing you are now within the boundaries of the Nature Center, so they're a little hard to get to, particularly these last two shelters. But these were designed by the National Park Service. You can really tell because they're much more rustic. At this time, the National Park Service's designs were very rustic, and we can see that, you know, with this formation of the rocks down here. Less refined than the design that Hare had. And then this is another shelter that's within the Nature Center. That's very hard to get to, unfortunately. You'll see what condition it is in now. There are still some trails that go from the Lakeshore Road. You can find those, and they'll bring you up to some of these shelters. So if ever you go out there, you have to seek them out, but it's worth the effort to do it. With the use of the Civilian Conservation Corps and the WPA, many of our city parks received improvements. And this was a terrace that was done at Oakland Lake Park. Oakland Lake is in far east Fort Worth. This is one of my favorites from this era. Also, Trail Drivers Park is another one of my favorites off of Northeast 28th. I really love the setting of this particular shelter. And what I also like about Trail Drivers Park, I was in the parking lot one day and I just saw this formation, and so I could imagine Hare, you know, thinking about this, perhaps molding these hills and then planting these trees to give us this wonderful little view here. But the shelter at Trail Drivers also sits up on a hill, and it too gives you a good view of the downtown skyline. Greenway Park, which I mentioned was one of the parks for African Americans, it too received improvements, including a shelter, trails, various athletic fields. Unfortunately, these didn't last long because of the construction of what's now I-35. It went right through Greenway Park, so about all we have left of it now is the eastern half of it. Not nearly as developed as we see here. If you go look at historic aerial photographs, you can see some of the design that was done for this particular park. The WPA was used to employ recreation directors who did things such as teach the children tap dancing lessons, as we see here. This is within the recreation building that I showed you earlier. Through the recreation department, an orchestra, the WPA orchestra, was sponsored, and they would, besides giving performances around the county, they would give music lessons to students on Saturdays. And one of the bands that was a part of this program was the Dixie Park Playground Band, and here we see them at a tree planting ceremony in Dixie Park. There were several golf courses that were improved, and we had Rockwood Golf Course. The first portion of it, the first 9 holes, were developed by the Civilian Works Administration, and then the WPA did the rest of it. Z Boaz, which we recently lost as a golf course, it's no longer a golf course. It was one of them that was developed. Worth Hills, which is now where there's a bunch of housing for TCU. That one was improved. And then Meadowbrook was acquired during the 1930s, and it was improved with the use of WPA funds. The Park Department partnered with the Fort Worth ISD to improve playgrounds or to create entirely new campuses if the school was new. And this was one of the things that both Kessler and Hare had recommended, that because many of our neighborhoods didn't have parks, they said, well, let's improve the playgrounds so we'll have an area for the neighborhood kids to go play. And this was one of the better examples, well, extensive examples of design that was done for a school campus. This is Arlington Heights, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with it, right along I-30. Again, it's been a victim to progress and transportation. It's lost this reflection pool here, much of this landscaping here. There's been many additions done to the building, and we'll see that in a bit. But this is a photo here of some of the WPA workers working on this vista, which was one of the things that Hare was really known for. They're the ones who also did the designs for the playground improvement program. And this is, unfortunately, is a view of the vista today. Because of the addition of all of these temporary classrooms, we've lost much of that vista. But the one good thing, I took this photograph on a Saturday, and we see people out enjoying the playfield, which is exactly what the improvement of the playgrounds was supposed to do, to give people a place to go and have fun. And we see that still happening 60 years later, 70 years later. And this was a series of photographs that was done by the city's forester, a little bit of propaganda. You know, why are we doing this? Besides giving employment to people who needed it, it was also very beneficial to our city's youth. I mean, what happens if they don't have a creative way to spend their free time? Are they going to be in an alley shooting craps? Or are they going to be out flying a kite? After the war, the city begins to expand quickly, and so the park department and the recreation department try to keep up with that. So that's when we begin to see more community recreation centers. The first one was the Northside Recreation Center, and there was actually a park that was created at the same time for this particular recreation center. We had about 5 recreation centers that were built between 1948 and 1960. One of them was the Sycamore Recreation Center, which was placed in Sycamore Park. Where the old recreation building was, it was right next to it was a lumber yard, so there really wasn't a lot of room for kids to go out and play other than inside the building. So they moved the recreation department to this particular rec building at Sycamore Park. In the 1950s, we began to see changes in the use of our parks. Our African American community is agitating more for access to parks. They are taxpayers. They should have access to them. So one of the things that the city does is try to improve the parks that they already have, to try to, hold off that eventual integration by giving them improvements in the facilities that they can use. And one of them was the creation of the Harmon Recreation Center in what was originally Harmon Park. And then Dixie Park at the time was probably one of the most popular parks for African Americans. It had a swimming pool. It would have these little concession rides. But as the neighborhoods began to change, Hillside Park, which is not too far from this, became designated as an African American park. And so Dixie Park, which had a very small pool, was closed and eventually sold. And there's an old car wash sitting there now. We have many zoo improvements in the 1950s, the creation of the Children's Zoo in 1953, and then the Record Aquarium a year later. There would also be the Herpetarium that was constructed in the 1950s, and then sort of something unusual, there was a rainforest exhibit that was opened in 1960. We've lost the aquarium and the Herpetarium. They've recently constructed a new building that they call the Museum of Living Art. We have the first really big expansion of the Botanic Garden at this time. It was originally just about 37 acres, And so we had an addition to the west of what was the horseshoe area, one of my favorite areas of the park. I love this right here. But the rose garden is right here, so this is just to the west of the rose garden. We're also beginning to see more developers put parks within their residential developments. And one of them in particular was very generous and actually gave the city the land for the parks. That was the Foster Development Company. They gave land for parks such as Kellis and also Foster Park. And again, this design was done by Hare and Hare. We also see the addition of a few more shelters. You can see these shelters are more modern, less ornamental. But what I love about this is at Oakland Lake Park, and it's where that WPA terrace was. Initially there was supposed to be a WPA shelter constructed with this, but it wasn't completed at that time, so it would be another 20 years before they actually got a shelter in this park. But we're beginning to see more designs by local architects. There was the beginning of a pushback from the local architectural community to Hare and Hare. Why is this outside firm doing so much of the work? Why can't we be doing this? And so this is one of those instances where a Fort Worth architect designed this particular shelter. Log Cabin Village comes after the war. In the late 1950s, there was a group of citizens who were concerned about the rapid disappearance of the frontier vestiges of North Texas. And so they began to seek out log cabins and to collect them as such. And they were given a spot in Forest Park to locate these cabins. And in 1965, Log Cabin Village actually became under the jurisdiction of the Park Department. We're back to what do we do with the river. In 1969, the mayor creates a group that becomes known as Streams and Valley to study how can we improve the Trinity River. And so Streams and Valley brings in Lawrence Halprin, a very well-known landscape architect from San Francisco, to study the river and what can we do to enhance it, how can we enhance our whole park system. And this was his plan for the bluff. He has a little pavilion here and a few more trails and that type of thing around here. I was always sort of surprised to see this. It's a very modern pavilion type of thing, and from what we end up getting later, I was just surprised when I first came across this, being put there on the bluff, sort of sacrilegious in some people's opinion. Again, we have interest in urban parks, urban renewal. This was the creation of the Water Garden by Philip Johnson, a very famous architect, and his partner John Burgee. Johnson had done the design for the Amon Carter Museum, and the Water Gardens was sponsored by the Carter Foundation. And so Ruth Carter Stevenson brought Philip Johnson in to create this urban park in this area, initially a 4-block area, very different from most of the parks we were used to, these concrete canyons and kind of unified by water. Here's some views of it. The quiet pool on the upper left, the aerated pool on the lower left, and then the active pool on the right. In the 1960s and 70s, we have the development of the Japanese garden. In the late 50s, the city's horticulturalist advocated for the construction of what he called an Oriental Garden. There was a quarry within the Botanic Garden. He thought that would be a great place to put this Japanese garden. So they actually began work on it in the 1960s, but it wasn't opened to the public until the 1970s. But much of the work that was done here was done through the Fort Worth Garden Club and then what became the Fort Worth Botanical Society. So many of these major improvements that we're seeing at this time were done as a result of partnerships with other organizations, and this is a good example. And there's still this very close association with the Fort Worth Botanical Society and the Japanese Garden. The man on the left here, that's Scott Fikes. It was his idea to create the Japanese garden, Oriental Garden as he called it. And then in the 70s, we were thinking about how can we celebrate the bicentennial, and so one of the things that was done was the creation of Heritage Park along the river in the area of the original fort. And so they started improving it around 1976 as part of the bicentennial, and Lawrence Halprin, who did that early river study, was brought back to create a park design within the larger Trinity Heritage Park, which is 112 acres. But he came up with a plaza that's only about an acre. But it was completed in 1980. And it was meant to be a celebration of the river and also the fort itself. You can see there's sort of an abstraction here of the original fort and the Trinity River here. Again, it was another one of those urban parks that incorporated water. You know, a very, very common thing for urban parks during this time to have water. Unfortunately, the water's been shut off here. Heritage Park is closed off to the public now, and that's one of the things, you know, we'll see what's going to happen to this particular park. We have a redesign of Brunette Park. Remember, we had more of that formal design I showed you earlier. So in 1984, they brought in Peter Walker. The Brunette Foundation brought him in. Again, more partnerships. So he did this total redesign of Brunette Park with these crisscross walks and little candlestick fountains. Again, water, lots of water in the park. In 1978, a city ordinance was created that actually specified that developers had to set aside land for parks. And so this is an example of one of the parks that was set aside within this large residential area. But in 1982, it was transformed into a playground that was fully accessible to disabled children, and it was the first such park in the country. Then in the late 2000s, if you say that right, 2010, we see another redesign of Brunette Park. There were people downtown who thought that Brunette Park was just being used more as a pass-through. People weren't going there to enjoy it. Maybe there had been too much success with some of the growth of the vegetation. People felt very enclosed there and not so safe. So they thinned out some of the trees. They planted lower shrubs so it would be more open. They took out the water features because they're very high maintenance items. And then they created a playground area also, let's see, over here, because we're beginning to have more families downtown, and they thought it was important to have a place for children who were now living downtown, to have a place for them to go play. So it was again recreated, but done by Peter Walker, the same one who had done the initial redesign in 1984. So what is going to happen with our parks? We are going to have the bond issue in the spring. There's many millions of dollars that have been set aside for the improvement of parks. So hopefully there's been 1.5 million set aside for studies and work done on Heritage Park. So if that passes, then hopefully we'll see Heritage Park come back on board. We're probably going to continue to see more partnerships, such as the partnership that was done for the creation of the one of the Northside recreation centers. It was done in a partnership with the YWCA. And then because of the Barnett Shale in Fort Worth, the park department is beginning to get revenue to put back into our parks, and so that has been a good thing as far as the development of parks. And we've had things such as the new Ben Hogan Golf Center that was created at Rockwood Park. So hopefully we have a bright future for our parks coming up, but we'll just have to see. So thank you very much.